Let me give you the microphone, Kristi, just a second, please. I mean, not the microphone, but really the control of the session. So let's go ahead now.
Okay, can you see my first screen okay?
Yes, we can see it very well. Thank you. Go ahead.
Perfect. All right, thank you so much to you both for that very nice introduction. So I wanted to give you a little information about how to reach me here on this first slide. I will put this up again at the end, and I will be happy to make my slides available. If anybody wants to email me, I can send those to you. I will also make them available to the good folks at the Institute. So you'll have this afterwards. You can easily find me if you just search for query.com, Q-U-E-R-I. And this presentation is the result of actually a few years of research on the way scholars talk about the role of software and particularly how it interacts with methods and what's the relationship between software and methods. I don't know how many of you have familiarity with some of these great packages, but I want to do a brief introduction just to get you grounded in case they feel new to you. And then the presentation is divided roughly into two parts. One is the data or the literature that I analyzed and the way I analyzed it. And the next are these four voices or tropes that appeared to me as I looked at this literature about the relationship between qualitative data analysis software and qualitative methods. And from there, I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to focus on one of the tropes that occur throughout this literature, and it's the chicken and egg trope. And while we've done a little bit of theorizing around this, about the mutual influence between methods and software, I've found some really interesting implications in the way people have analyzed interactive digital art. So I'm going to pivot to look at some of those to get your head thinking about new ways of looking at how people and software interact. And then I'm going to end with a cure for what I'm calling over-tropification, because by the time I'm done, you might be tired of all these tropes. And they can be useful, but sometimes they can be overdone. Okay, so first, very quickly, just one slide. Qualitative data analysis software has quite a few capabilities, and there are some that are specialized, but they have some core characteristics that they're known for. You can assign themes or codes to particular pieces of qualitative data. And not only can you assign those, you can assign multiple codes to a single portion. And that lets you look for relationships to cross-reference when things might co-occur, to investigate what I often call constellations in the data. You can import quantitative demographic data, really it's any nominal, ordinal, or interval value, as a means of comparing subgroups in the data. You can track researcher ideas through memoing and linking, all the thinking that goes along with the coding. And then finally, all of these provide output, either reports or visualizations that can be used to present findings. So that's kind of the core structure of how all of these are framed or shaped. I'm not going to go into the history, but I did want to give you a few references if you're interested in learning more about the evolution of the software and some of the debates in it. Part of the reason I'm pointing you to these, although there's other good ones, all of these use extensive references. So if you go to any of these, you're going to find a lot of other materials that you can continue researching in case you want to dig a little deeper. And now let me start with part one. Okay, so part one is about the data that I analyzed and these four voices or tropes about the relationship between software and methods. So I created a database of literature on qualitative data analysis software, and it actually ranged quite a bit from the inception, the early inception of these programs in the, most of them were in the late 80s, early 90s, up until now. And I used several databases. I also used my extensive library and Pat Baisley's library. And I also looked for the terms QDAS and Cactus and 7 different options of the programs. The here, but what I want to talk to you about are the 150 that really talked about the relationship between software and methods. Many of them just talked about software more generally. And then the analytical perspective I took on looking through all this was first just a descriptive coding. And I was doing that to get a lay of the land, who was saying what and across what years. But then I started seeing these patterns of the ways methods and software were being linked. I started to take a more constructionist perspective and a critical discourse analysis to look at the way language was being leveraged around certain claims and the role of the software. So the four tropes I want to cover are first, the early bird trope. These are the early adopters. Next, the snake oil trope, which is the claims that the software is nothing but a hoax or a trick or something that's there to deceive you or take over. Then the horse cart trope, which is it's okay to use software, but only if you know method first. So always puts software in the back seat. And then finally, the chicken and egg, which is the attempt to look at the ongoing interaction, relationship, and influence between software and method. So these evolved, I would say, somewhat temporally and historically, but actually the evolution, I think, started here at the end. The folks that developed a lot of these programs, because they were there in practice, working with data, working with the technology, were doing a lot of talking and thinking about the relationship between software and methods. I would say then the early birds got on board, and the snake oil was a quick response to some of the claims of the early birds. The horse cart was kind of a way to legitimate things along the way, and I think we've arrived at another chicken egg moment. So even though these are somewhat historical, they're all alive and well today, and you will see them definitely in the literature that you look at. So first, what's a trope? I think of a trope for this presentation as a vivid figure of speech, and it can start as an interesting motif, but it can also turn into a cliche. The purpose is to add interest to claims that are being made, so readers can follow and retain information. They often are used to persuade or make an argument. And I'm going to focus on two, although I did go a little overboard, so these two might not hold up by the time I'm done. So the first is hyperbole, which is an exaggeration as a rhetorical device. And this is when a trope becomes kind of a monochromatic rendering potentially. And here's two examples in relation to the current talk. One is qualitative data analysis software will solve your problems. And the other is QDAS is like HAL in a space odyssey and will try to destroy you. So those are examples of some of the hyperbole that come up with the tropes. I'm going to try to use metaphor comparisons to point out some of this hyperbole. And again, I'm using the metaphors of early bird, snake oil, horse cart, and chicken egg. So the early bird metaphor. I often think of this as the promised land, silver bullet, golden egg, Ron Popeil trope. And so again, this trope is about how wonderful everything could be and how this will solve all of your problems. Here's an example of some of the early bird hyperbole in the literature. And I have a quote here that I'll go ahead and read that says, according to Robson, humans as natural analysts have deficiencies and biases. Acknowledging these shortfalls is of great help in working to reduce possible distortions and predispositions. Table 1 presents our interpretation of these deficiencies when considered in the context of semi-structured interview studies. So a pretty serious claim that actually the researcher is the one who's flawed, not the software. And in the table that they discuss following this quote, there are 12 deficiencies of the human that are identified, including information overload, confidence in judgment, and consistency. So once again, this is an extreme example, and it's part of the hyperbole of some of the early bird discourse. But I think it's a good example to get you thinking about it and to make you aware of it when you see some of this in literature. Okay, now the snake oil metaphor. I often think of this as the beware of turning your head and letting technology do the work. Feel free to use deception to produce results. Quantify and ye shall be punished. And if you're tired and lazy, this is the thing for you. Once again, the snake oil metaphor is designed to encapsulate some of the extreme critics of why one shouldn't use this technology at all. And so here's another example of a quote from some of the literature. There are still many qualitative researchers who either ignore or actively question the use of such software, implying that its use in conjunction with more traditional methods of analysis is corrupting. Okay, so that ipso facto, it will corrupt the process. You can see how different this is from the earlier claim. All right, next we have the horse cart metaphor. So this is the notion that it's okay to play the game with software, but you need to know your place. And that place is at the back, at the end, or behind other important things. So to self-actualize, you must first climb this gigantic pyramid. Of course, you have miles for a free flight, but first you have to pay this booking fee. Oh, you need a ladder. It just so happens we're the only place you can buy one. And welcome to Theoretical Framework Game Show, where you can't advance to the next challenge unless you can spell Vygotsky. So once again, these are just ways that people make claims that you can participate, but only in a certain way. And I love this quote. I want to spend a little more time on this one than the others. Just so you know, this piece by Gilbert is a wonderful piece, so I highly recommend it. But what she's done with this quote, I think it wasn't her intent. She's really showed the need to use a discourse where methods come first. So first, let's look at the first part. Software developers and users of QDA programs have complained that the programs have been condemned for flaws that more properly apply to the methods themselves, and called for a more vigorous and general discussion of methods. These references that are embedded here are also excellent. And so you can see in this first passage, the point is that if software appears to be doing damage, it's actually just revealing a problem with the method being used within it. So the method comes first, but the software is revealing it. And the next portion of this quote, QDA programs should not be censored for crystallizing standard practices or for explicating existing problems. Neither should software developers be in the position of driving methodological development because other qualitative researchers don't sufficiently articulate analytical procedures and goals. Okay, so once again, the notion that if you look inside the software and see bad research, that it's actually not the software, it's the methods that preceded the software. And then finally, the chicken and egg metaphor. This is the way of thinking about the mutual interaction between software and methods. And again, I think in some of the early literature, there was more discussion of this, and I'm going to talk about this more in a minute. That's how I'll conclude the discussion today. But I think often in the literature, the extreme position around the chicken and egg is what you hear a lot from scholars when sometimes they don't want to be bothered with answering the question, and that is, well, it depends, right? Is software good or bad? Well, it depends. Although it often doesn't get qualified. You know, when is it good? When is it problematic? Okay, so that's the chicken-egg hyperbole. All right, now I want to move on to part two. Now that I just outlined some of those tropes, let's focus on the chicken-egg, and we'll look at lessons from interactive digital art to focus on them. And then, again, I want to provide a little bit of a cure for all of these tropes in the event that they either get overwhelming to listen to or because they're used too casually or carelessly in the literature. This chicken and egg reality that I want to talk through is about getting comprehensive because the chicken egg understanding actually sees some of the wisdom in the other tropes and often incorporates them. I've listed several authors here and things that they talk about, and they're just some good examples of this interaction. So technology always has had an interactive relationship with the researcher. There's a complex interaction between software and method. Tools can be both enabling and limiting. Technology and researcher are mutually constituting. Knowledge is both embedded and constructed. And there's an elusive relationship between software and methodology. So you can see how many of these claims are more in line with the chicken and egg approach. Okay, so I'm really switching gears here as I come to my main point here while I'm concluding. Though I think we've done a good job of pointing to the importance of looking at the interaction of software and method, I'm not sure we've theorized it really heavily, nor have we researched it really well. And I want to talk about some research on interactive digital art. And what I have here is an artist rendition of a piece called Wooden Mirror. And you can actually find this if you Google or if you go to YouTube and look for Daniel Rosen Wooden Mirror, you'll see a video of this display. So I want to explain it to you. It's a panel of about 830 square wooden tiles. And the back of each tile is connected to an individual motor that can tilt the tiles independently. So a visitor, like this woman, can approach the display, and there's a tiny camera in the middle of it that collects her information, her gestures, her motions, and then it relays that information to the back of the tiles so they adjust to reflect light. So it's actually a moving mirror, but it's wooden. So this real-time reflection is quite a novelty for people who haven't seen it because wood isn't typically thought of as a reflective material. Following the conference where Rosen displayed this, he also made quite a few others, and some of them are really fun to watch. They include things like stuffed penguins and shiny balls, and he used the same kind of technology and using objects to reflect images. So why am I turning to this piece and this playful interaction between person and technology? There's a wonderful book by Bolter and Gramala called Windows and Mirrors. And what they pursue in this piece, and part of it was actually looking at Daniel Rosen's Wooden Mirror, is whether technology controls the person or the person controls the technology, just as you saw in the last slide. And this is really similar to the debates between QDAS and researchers. And what they argued is that Wooden Mirror was so successful, along with other pieces like it, because it allows the person to oscillate between the technology being invisible or being available for scrutiny. In other words, there's this rhythm between interacting with the technology, enjoying the immediate experience, and then kind of stepping back to analyze the interface to assess how it worked. And just about every participant in this exhibit did those two things. They would play and then they would stop and try to figure out how it worked. And they noticed this with other digital art as well. And the focus here, which I've underlined, is on this oscillating, this moving back and forth between ignoring the technology and seeing where it takes you, and then looking at it critically. So they have a quote here: good digital design, like digital art, can reshape its contexts as well as respond to them. In fact, it reshapes contexts by responding to them. Digital art redefines contexts. And it may take a read of this book to fully understand how rich this is, but it's a really deep look into that interaction between person and technology. I want to go over one more of these. Biomorphic Font by Diane Gramala. So this vanishing point, again, is a rendering of a video, and the font actually moves as you are either reading or writing. To interact with Biomorphic Font, there's a biofeedback machine that measures people's skin temperature and breath rate, and the font changes according to changing biology of the person. So the words might take on an appearance of vanishing or melting or blurring or developing sharper edges. And you can find an example of this font on Diane Gramala's website. So while this font focuses on a limited range of physiology and physical responses, the goal is for either authors or readers, because it can be hooked up to either, to become more self-aware and reflective of the way physical and emotional realities influence or are influenced by the narrative on the screen. And one of Gramala's quotes is, "How it looks and what it says can never really be separated." So one of the lessons for qualitative researchers is that our pursuits of reflexivity might be genuine. We may often try to put our lenses on ourselves and think through our position, our point of view, but they're limited often by a cerebral focus on data. So I'm arguing that qualitative researchers could pay more attention to their physiological states, their emotional and physiological states while they're handling data, and that potentially technologies like qualitative data analysis software can provide feedback. I'm not suggesting that everybody gets hooked up to biofeedback while they're coding, but right now there's nothing that does anything like that. And it could add to the way researchers are understanding the way they interact with technology. Okay, so there's just two examples. And then finally, I have a couple more slides after this, but I want to pull back now and think about these tropes and how they can be overdone. And it's the sort of my prescription and the point of the discussion, or what I'm trying to persuade you to do. So from part one, before you use a quote describing the impact of qualitative data analysis software, go back to the source. And it's amazing how often people get quoted in literature that's either justifying or criticizing QDAS, and it's obvious that they haven't read the original source because it's a little bit misinterpreted or not fairly represented. And watch out for those tropes I identified. Now that I've pointed them out, I think it'll be easier to read certain materials and look at which trope is in play. Also, look out for the discourse of what I call case making. So this is all the reasons the author is correct, and as a result, they're telling you what to think. And the alternative to that is a kind of a discourse of inquiry, and those are the ways that an author tries to go about thinking through and investigating a topic, like the relationship between software and method, including the conundrums they encountered or unexpected turns that they experienced. If you do those two things and you find that the original source is well-reasoned or well-researched, then use it. And if not, move on. And you are going to be amazed when you do this extra legwork how little of it is well-reasoned, because there's a lot of case making that goes on when people talk about their use of the software or their resistance to it. And then from part two, I would encourage everyone to contribute to the establishment of a research agenda that focuses on this space where researchers and technologies meet. And practice theory is a great place to start because it looks at this dynamic influence between software and method and researcher in iterative cycles. Okay, so I do want to spend a minute on some acknowledgements here, and I usually put these up front, but I knew that it would just feel so scattered that it might start us off on the wrong foot. If you're interested in this notion of tropes and rhetoric, Patty and Peter Adler have a great piece in Sociological Quarterly in 2008 where they use slightly different approach than what I've used here, but they talk about tropes and they talk about the tropes in ethnography. So that might be a richer place to go for kind of the connection between epistemology, methodology, ideology, and how they come out in tropes. And then I also wanted to acknowledge that there's two pieces I have in press right now that haven't been published. One is about lessons from interactive digital art, and it talks about the two pieces I briefly discussed, but others as well, and some of the implications on thinking about our interaction with technology. And also I have another piece coming out about turning against each other in neoliberal times, and it's about the discourse really between the early birds and the snake oil and how that is really causing our scholarship to suffer. So if this talk that I just went through is something you want to pursue further, or you want to look at other ideas like it, you'll find similar things in these two pieces when they come out. I also want to acknowledge Lakoff and Johnson for Metaphors We Live By, which has changed the way I look at discourse. So if these tropes or metaphors are interesting to you, I recommend going there. And then finally, I want to acknowledge, in terms of the origination of these ideas, Lynn Richards, because in her book, Handling Qualitative Data, one of the first, and it has a more recent issue, by the way, than this 2005, but she started this because she realized as she was working with researchers that we like to talk as though we teach epistemology and then theory and then methodology and coming up with a research problem and good research questions and then a protocol and then collect data and then analyze it. And she observed over and over again that people have qualitative data land in their lap and then they have to figure out what to do with it. So instead of forcing all of the theory and methodology first and the tools and technology next, she talks about ways that you can learn some of those things while handling data. And it's a great piece. So I'd encourage you to get it if you don't have it. Windows and Mirrors by Bolter and Gramala had a big impact on how I started looking at interactive digital art and the lessons it could teach us. And then finally, I want to thank my collaborators, Trina Paulus and Judy Davidson, who have helped to construct digital tools for qualitative research as a collaborative group. Trina Paulus has a book of the same title. And I just wanted to end here before my last slide that if some of this sounds interesting to you and you want to talk to researchers who are looking at these spaces, you'll see that our purpose here is bringing together qualitative researchers to discuss the role of digital tools in the ongoing construction of qualitative research practice. We have a special interest group at the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry, although we're active other places, and there are quite a few ways to reach us, communicate with us, and learn more. Okay, and then finally, I'll just leave that slide up so that you have information on where to reach me as we go to some discussion or question and answer. And I ended here a little bit early, but I'm assuming that that gives us either more time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Kristi. So let's open up the discussion. Any questions that you have for her? Kristi, are you there?
Oh, I am here.
Yeah, your screen went blank.
Aha, I see it did.
Yeah. Okay, now it's
Don't know
back.
why that happened.
Now it's back to the slide.
Huh. That might have been because I went to the chat box just to see what was going on there. So let me see if I can get it back again.
All right. So while she fixes that, everybody, any questions for her? We don't have any questions yet, but let's do the following, okay? Those of you who want to talk, to ask questions, you can click on the hand icon next to your name in the control panel. But at the same time, you can write down the question in the question section. So here I have one. Just a second, please. I think it was Jeremiah. Was it you? Your hand was, I thought I saw it up, and now it's not up anymore. If you want to ask a question, please raise it again. Okay, there you go. I'm going to open your microphone, Jeremiah. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. All right, you may not have a working microphone. The microphone is opened already.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead. We can hear you. Try again, Jeremiah. No, it's too low. Maybe you could try to write down your question using the questions pane in the control panel. That would be the best option. Okay, so we look forward to receiving your question. I will now see who else would like to speak. Let me see here.
And I'd be interested in hearing from anybody who disagrees, because I'm sure there are people who do about this space where researchers and technologies meet. I still hear a lot of the horse cart arguments from people that you have to do no methods before software, and I am now using a mantra of methods with software rather than methods before software, and it seems to me that's a minority view. So I'm happy to have a little discussion about that if anybody feels that way.
All right. We have a question here from Vicky, but Vicky is not fully connected. It seems that her microphone or her telephone is muted. So I just sent you a pin. Vicky, you have to type #14# in order to fully connect. But if it's the same question that she wrote before, she wrote a question about how can ATLAS.ti help her. So what I said is that the best would be that I answer that question by email. She said that she performed a transcription of 45-minute interview using Dragon software. I ended up with a 10-page paragraph with no punctuation and a strange wording since the participant had a Kentucky accent, she added. And then she follows by asking, how can ATLAS.ti help me? So, Kristi, let me propose the following, that you answer the first part that has to do with Dragon software, and I can answer the second part by email, okay?
Sure. Well, I want to make sure I understand the question. The question is what to do once Dragon has done all that and has spit out data without punctuation?
I think that what you can talk about is the use of that kind of software for transcription, because she said that that the result was not as expected. So maybe you can say something about that in general. The use of that kind of software.
Yeah, and this is it's a good example of how the technology is doing something to your data, and you have an idea of what it should look like, and that's not what the technology does. And those are important moments to reflect on. So almost every researcher that I know who uses voice recognition like Dragon, and then either uses qualitative data analysis software or not, finds that there's a significant amount of time training and or going back through to listen to, edit, and correct and add things like punctuation and paragraph marks. So I think what you're experiencing is common among people who use that kind of technology. And it's an important moment to stop and think through, were there pauses, gaps, or breaks that need to go in as part of your either perception of being in the interview or listening to it afterwards that help represent the data? And in fact, this reminds me of, there's a great piece by Oakes, OCHS, on transcriptionist theory. And one of the things that she does with an example is shows that in traditional education research, there's a transcript with two columns, and the teacher or the instructor is often on the left column, and the student was often on the right column. And she showed that just by that common convention that researchers were using, it gave a false impression that teachers were always leading and students were always following. And when reversed, different interpretive ideas would come up where you'd see the actions or the agency of the students. So it's important to think through how just the way that you're writing up data or transcribing it before you've even thought about getting to the place where you're handling it by coding or writing or linking, and how that can influence how you're seeing things. But it's going to happen no matter what you use. It's going to happen whether you transcribe or whether you use Dragon. So it's a good place to do some reflection.
Okay, thank you. I have here the written question from Jeremiah, and he said the following. I just wanted to acknowledge the existence of the four tropes, particularly the early bird from very seasoned, or rather older researchers who are skeptical about use of QDA's technology. I am a PhD student using qualitative research and intend to use qualitative software. And he added a comforting presentation.
And what was the last part?
Yeah, he just said comforting presentation, kind of congratulating you for the presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ricardo. You broke up on me there at the end, so
Okay.
I heard his first part, but
Okay, so let me make sure that my connection is okay. All right, so let me read again what he said. He said, I just wanted to acknowledge the existence of the four tropes, particularly the early bird from very seasoned, or rather older researchers who are skeptical about the use of QDAS technology. I am a PhD student using qualitative research and intend to use software in my analysis. And then he congratulates you for the presentation. So it's
oh,
not a question. It's not really a question. It's just adding something to the presentation. And now we have another one, Sandy. And Sandy, let me try to give you the microphone. I will open your microphone now. Go ahead, Sandy.
I don't think I have a microphone that works, do I?
Yes, I do. Well, we do hear you. Just speak a little bit louder if you could.
Sure. I was wondering how important it is to know about which method or methodology a software program was originally developed for. Is that the way that it usually works with the development of the programs?
it's a great question, and different people will answer that in different ways. But my take on this is that was probably more important 20 years ago than it is now, because they were much more specialized 20 years ago. And what happened with the development of these software programs, it's fairly typical, just so you know, it's fairly typical of software development in general. So could be in other kinds of programs. There's often a really big diversity of how they're being created and for what and why. And then they start borrowing from each other because they realize, oh, people doing grounded theory might want to use this too, or people doing discourse analysis might want to use this too. So what's happened over time is that the software that are the most popular have very similar tools. And I don't mean to insult at all the wonderful scholars who created them for particular reasons, but in many ways they're trying to be adaptable. And one of the common criticisms, one of the common snake oil criticisms is that as they've gotten more similar, it means they're pushing homogeneous research method on researchers, when in reality, there's a big difference between a standard cadre of tools that do a lot of different things and homogeneous method. So a lot of us who've been using the software for a long time don't buy that argument, because they've all gotten more expansive, more powerful, more diverse. I think it can't hurt you to understand where some of them came from and to read some of the literature from the developers. But here's another thing I like to say. So here's how I'll conclude my answer to this. I often feel like when people debate which software is better for a particular approach, I think it's a lot like either using Mac or PC and debating which of those you should use if you're writing a novel. I'm sure there are people that prefer using one or the other to write their novel, but it's the least of your worries. The bigger concern is a good design and good collection and being aware and knowing what you're doing with the data. So they have far more in common than they have differences, the most common ones. So I wouldn't, I guess, so the end is I wouldn't spend too much time trying to understand where they came from.
Right, cool.
Sandy, you have a follow-up question. Could you say it out loud?
Sure. So I work on a large study, a large qualitative study, which is longitudinal. So I have learnt the methods along with the software just because it was going to be too big, too unwieldy to try and do it on paper. And it's been good to manage so many transcripts in a software program. But I guess one of the drawbacks of that, I have had some training along the way, is that some of my early errors with coding or with knowing the software are kind of restricting me now, I guess. Sometimes I feel a bit constrained by the software, and also, like my early codes were very descriptive, and now I'm struggling to change the code names and kind of keep track of that without without it being too much, and it's quite difficult to delete things or retire things. And so I find myself a bit reluctant to add more codes because I have so many all there right from the beginning.
Right.
So I'm going to talk about this in my thesis, but I just wondered if you had any hints for how to manage these issues. I mean, would you learn a little bit of methods first and do a little bit of coding, or would you just go right into the program?
No, I mean, I would say, so I wouldn't encourage anybody to go right into the program without help. And that usually means a good mentor, somebody who can help you talk through when you're doing things, what choices you're making. And, I think the sample data, you can get stuck in a box of thinking about how one of these packages work by looking at any of the sample projects that come with them. So doing it alone, I would always say is really probably a bad idea. And understanding some things about qualitative methods before you get into a program is also probably a good idea in broad scope. But there's just a tremendous amount to be learned by handling it. Now, what you described with the early emphasis on descriptive coding and difficulty shifting actually has been identified by some of the early developers. And the problem is it's now so much easier to code. You can code lots quickly, and you can create lots and lots and lots of codes. Whereas when you were working on paper, there was a sense you had to be a little bit more judicious about what you were marking up and how you were marking it up. But I still think this notion of having descriptive codes and needing to move to more interpretive spaces and thinking about constellations or connections or more interpretive moves is common. I mean, it happens when people work in paper too. It's not just a software issue. I know that Pat Baisley, in her book on qualitative methods, it's got sorry, I can't remember the title right now, but it's got a red cover, I can see it in my head. She actually has some strategies for moving into those different kinds of coding structures. And I would also recommend Johnny Saldana's coding manual, because he talks about so many different ways to think about coding and moving through different coding processes. So I don't have a magic answer, but I think that there's many people who have explored this and that there's things to read about it. And I would say showing somebody you trust and who understands what you're trying to do and how you think, you're showing them your coding structure, and if they understand qualitative methods, they'll probably have some really good suggestions for you. So I don't think it's a cookie cutter suggestion for how to get through it, but I'm sure you can. I know you can.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, both of you. Now I will give the microphone or offer the microphone to Floriano Filio. So let me see, Floriano, if you have a working microphone. Just a second here. Okay, go ahead, Floriano. Hi, say a few words. Let me see if we can hear you. No, it doesn't seem that will work. So let me read this out loud, okay? Let me see. Okay, so he says the following. I have never used ATLAS.ti or other QDA software, but I'm planning to use software in my PhD thesis. I am not really intending to discuss the tropes you mentioned, but just use the tool as a helper in coding, organizing my sources, including news articles and film documentaries, and creating notes automatically. What is your take on that approach?
So it's probably not the answer you were expecting, but my take is your committee is always right. And so I work with so many doctoral students and master students who are using software, and they use it different ways, and they often have very different perspectives from the people that are on their committee. And so I'm often really reluctant to give advice to people who have those committees, because I could say something that I think is a great idea, and I know somebody on the committee might disagree. I do sometimes work with students on what questions you might ask the committee, or how you might frame a brief proposal about how you plan to use the software, and how you might pass that by your chair or pass it by your committee before you get too far down the process. Now that can be very useful. I think that using software, to back up a little bit, using this kind of software just to organize is fine as a strategy, but there may be tools in it that you aren't aware of that can help you get a second look at data, look at things from different angles, try to see constellations of things that are difficult to see when you're looking through the data one transcript at a time or one piece at a time. So even though you are thinking about just using it as an organizational tool, you might benefit by talking to somebody who uses that software. Tell them about your data and ask them what they would do, like what tools they would leverage inside the software, because it may do more than you think it can do. And so if part of the reason of using it as an organizational tool is precisely because you know that that would make a committee happy, then I think that's a great thing to do. You have to get done, and you have to use their guidance, and they're the ones that are setting the standards. So I think that concludes what I have to say about that. Oh, I can't hear anybody, I think.
Okay, I'm sorry. You know, while you were talking, I was typing, therefore I muted myself and I had forgotten to.
No problem. I've done that too. You're doing a great job moderating all these things.
Thank you. So now it's open. Floriano, do you have a question to follow up, or is that okay? And let me see if anybody else wants to talk. I don't see anybody else. Anyone else would like to ask a question to Kristi?
Let me say one more thing while I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, go on.
In relation to that last question, because I have this slide up, based on my years of working with students and working with the software, that third trope, the horse cart trope, is the one that committees often seem most comfortable with. So putting an articulation around the use of the software that clearly front loads the importance of methods and process, and that you could do it without the software if you needed to, but then showing how software could facilitate those things, can help store them, makes them more accessible if you want to reinterrogate them. That is the place where I think most people find the safest ground. I'm definitely in the chicken egg group, but to get through processes and people who have power and ideas about how things should be done, that trope I think is the one that I see the most in doctoral committees and master's committees.
Thank you, Kristi. Floriano Filio is following up with another question. He is asking, could you give me examples of other things I could do besides organizing the data with software?
Yes. So, well, it could be that we have different definitions of organize, and what I'm conceptualizing of organizing things, putting them into piles, may not be what you're thinking of. But let me use an example. And when I did my literature review, which I did inside in vivo and had a lot of, in fact, these materials that I'm talking about here, I realized that when we look at literature, we're often trained to start from the beginning and read through to the end, like in a research article, and we're looking for internal consistency and coherence. And is the design a good one for the question, and do the results seem well-founded based on the data, right? So it's like this internal logical connection. But when I coded across items, sometimes it was basic structural things like the methods or the research question, but sometimes it was other aspects. I was able to look then across the literature for a particular topic and see things that I actually hadn't seen before, even though I should have. And so one of them, just as an easy example from my lit review, is there's a really interesting article by Coffey, Holbrook, and Atkinson from 1996 that critiques the use of software, and it's pretty well articulated. It has some interesting points. And I hadn't realized over time how many people were citing it as a reason that there's a problem with software, even though that article doesn't contain any empirical research. It's all expository. It's all ideas. I think ideas are great and they're worth considering, but I hadn't realized how much this ongoing critique of the software was based on something that wasn't even based in research. And I should have seen that because I'm an expert in this field, but it wasn't until I coded across to see where it was referenced and how it was referenced that I realized what an anchor it was for some of these tropes, particularly for the snake oil trope. So for me, that's about a lot more than organizing. That's putting things in piles to see them in a different angle. And one of the things you may not be aware of is all these software packages can look at constellations or combinations of your codes. So if you're looking at a passage and you code it to 3 different places, later you can ask the software to show you that intersection or where 2 of them come up but 1 of them doesn't, and you start seeing the patterns in the data in a different way. So for me, that goes beyond simply organizing.
Thank you very much, Kristi. And that's all we have. We don't have any more questions from anybody. So what I would like to do is ask Yvette to say a few last words. Go ahead, Yvette.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, and thank you, Kristi, for such a wonderful presentation. Our next webinar will be on November 17th. 3 p.m. and that'll be with Mandy Archibald, and her topic will be what can qualitative researchers gain from art. You can also go and check out the IIQM website, iiqm.ualberta.ca, for all events coming up. We will be continuing with the Masterclass webinar series in 2017, so that schedule should be up before the end of the year. So we hope to you all join us next year as well.
Thank you very much, Yvette. Would you like to say a few last words, Kristi?
No, thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and I hope we can connect again soon.
Thank you very much, Kristi, for this great presentation. Thank you, all of you, for coming. This webinar series is now in its 4th year. We're going to go now into the 5th year, and we depend on your attendance. So please tell people that they can join and learn about qualitative methodology from very interesting people, researchers, and practitioners. So thank you, all of you, for coming, and we hope to see you on November the 17th with Mandy Archibald presenting what can qualitative researchers gain from art. Thank you, all of you. Goodbye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.